When you play Victoria 2, is this how all of your battles turn out? Do you not have any idea what any of these units do? And are you sick of getting gassed by the Germans? Well then this is the video for you. You can call me Ezekiel. This is how to run your military in Victoria 2. Let's jump in. At the center of any proper war are land battles. They start when two armies from warring countries meet in the same province. Whichever army was there first is the defender, the other is the attacker. During combat, each army arranges its brigades into two lines, one in the front and one in the back. These lines can only fit a limited number of brigades, which is determined by combat width and the terrain the battle is being fought on. Brigades that don't fit are put into reserve. Reserves replace brigades who are destroyed in combat. During combat, a 10-sided die is rolled every 5 days. Damage is then applied to each army based on the difference between the rolls, the leaders of each army, the terrain the battle is being fought on, and the stats of each army's brigades. Of these factors, brigades are the most important. Let's talk about them. A brigade is made of 3,000 soldiers. You can recruit them from any province with enough soldier pops to support a brigade. There are different types of brigades, each with different stats. First is infantry. When judging most brigades, two stats matter most: attack, which is used when in the attacking army, and defense, which is used in the defending army. Infantry start with a fair amount of both. Artillery is next, and it's really good. It has a special stat called support. Support is a % bonus added to the brigade's attack and defense when fighting from the back line. As you can see, the bonus is huge. These are hussars. Not the Polish-style winged hussars, but Western-style light hussars. They're not very good at fighting, but that's not what they're here for. Hussars have a great reconnaissance stat. Reconnaissance serves two purposes. First, it helps armies occupy provinces faster. Second, it reduces enemy dig-in at the start of a battle. Dig-in is built up over time by an army standing in a province. Each point of dig-in the defending army has is subtracted from the roll of the attacker. As combat goes on, dig-in gets reduced. This means that reconnaissance has no defensive purpose, but can be huge when attacking. Dragoons are like hussars, but with better combat stats and worse reconnaissance. This gives them the niche of either being expensive infantry or worse hussars. I never use them. Cuirassiers are an interesting option. They have no reconnaissance, but are the best cavalry for fighting. However, as technology improves, dragoons will replace them as the best fighters. This makes cuirassiers a bit of an early game novelty. These weirdos are the engineers. In combat, they're just weaker artillery, but that's not what they're here for. Engineers have the siege stat. It does one thing: reducing the penalty for capturing provinces with forts. Forts do two things. First, they make it take longer to capture a province. Second, they reduce the casualties taken by an army defending the province with the fort in it. Next are guards. They're similar to infantry, but have more attack and less defense. Interestingly, they can only be recruited from soldier pops of an accepted culture. Last are irregulars and cavalry. Irregulars are just worse infantry, and cavalry are worse dragoons. The only time you should use them is when you're playing as an uncivilized nation who doesn't have access to better units. There are two more brigade types that I haven't covered: tanks and airplanes. They don't come into play until certain technologies are researched, so let's talk about that. There are 6 lines of tech we care about: all of the army lines and the chemistry and electricity line in industry. First is army doctrine. It's all about defense. Each tech in the line increases your dig-in cap by 1. Meanwhile, the inventions improve the defense stat of your brigades. However, the later inventions do a bit of a switcheroo, and instead improve the attack stats of your brigades. The line also includes the invention that unlocks tanks. Next is light armament. It's all about attack. The techs reduce the combat width of your army and unlock more brigade types, while the inventions improve your brigade's attack stats. This is the heavy armament line. It's all about artillery. The last tech also includes a bunch of inventions for tanks. Military science improves organization, which helps your armies fight longer and more effectively. The line also features military directionism, which has a very special invention: gas attack. It adds a +3 bonus to all of your army's dice rolls. That's huge. The same tech also has the invention for gas defense, which cancels out gas attacks. Since gas is so powerful, it's best to get the military directionism tech as soon as it becomes available. This is army leadership. It improves morale in military tactics. I don't care much about morale, but tactics are important. The better your military tactics, the less casualties you'll suffer in battles. Finally, we have the chemistry and electricity line in the industry tab. It lets you have larger armies by increasing supply limits. Some of the inventions on this line also reduce casualties. Because of all these technologies, by the endgame, your brigades will become a lot stronger. Unfortunately, the cavalry isn't so lucky. They just become obsolete, replaced by airplanes and tanks. The first thing to understand about tanks and airplanes is that when you unlock them, they're very weak. This is because their default stats are low, but get improved with inventions. Once all of the appropriate inventions are unlocked, tanks will have a massive attack score, making them the best offensive unit in the game. Meanwhile, airplanes will have a high reconnaissance stat, making them a great replacement for hussars. Don't forget that an army needs leadership. Let's start with the officers. The more officer pops your country has, the better your army will fight. However, once 0.2% of your population are officers, there's no further effect. This makes 0.2% of your population the optimal amount of officers. Second, an army needs a leader to command it. Without a leader, an army will suffer penalties. Each leader has a background, a personality, and prestige, which determines their stats. These stats pass on to the army they're commanding. The background and personality of a leader are fixed, but prestige can be increased by winning battles. Now let's put all of this into practice. Let's start with some army compositions. The army I suggested in my first Victoria video, which is 4 brigades of infantry, 5 of artillery, and 1 of hussars, is still a great option. But let's say you want a defense-oriented army. In that case, you won't be needing the hussars' reconnaissance, so you can drop the hussar and add another brigade of infantry. If you want an offense-oriented army, keep the hussars and replace your infantry with guards. As the game goes on, you can double or even triple the size of these armies. Just make sure the ratios stay the same. When inventions finally make planes and tanks viable, using them is easy. Replace your hussars with airplanes, and your infantry and guards with tanks. Just remember that the goods needed to recruit these endgame brigades are expensive and in limited supply. Don't be surprised if your endgame military can only be partially mechanized. This works out anyway, as tanks aren't great at defending. You'll probably have noticed that the armies I'm suggesting are exactly half artillery. This is because artillery is only effective in the back line, and to keep the artillery in the back line, there has to be another brigade in the front line. So far, all of these armies are professional armies. That's to say, armies whose brigades are made up exclusively of soldier pops. But there's another way to structure your army, and that's to conscript it. Mobilized pops are one of the most powerful military assets a country has. Just by pressing the mobilize button, you'll get tons of free basic infantry. To take full advantage of these mobilized troops, you can keep standing armies consisting exclusively of non-infantry brigades like artillery and hussars. This way you'll have all of the necessary non-infantry brigades ready and waiting to merge with the mobilized troops. This style of conscripted army is way larger than your country would otherwise be able to support, all the while remaining just as effective as a professional army. However, there's one major disadvantage to conscript armies. If a war starts and you haven't mobilized in advance, you'll be defenseless. Remember, mobilization can take months. This means that the only countries who can safely use conscript armies are ones that are either isolated or so large that losing land doesn't matter to them. Alternatively, you could just use a mix of professional and conscript armies. This gives you some of the size of a conscripted army with some of the security of a professional army. Now let's talk about how to use these armies. "War never changes" is one of the most memorable quotes from the Fallout games. As memorable as it is, it sure as hell doesn't apply to Victoria. Paralleling history, the Napoleonic style of warfare with relatively small line battles and rapid movement will eventually give way to large, grinding trench wars. In gameplay terms, war in the early game can be fought rather aggressively. The penalties for attacking are light, and concentrating your whole army in one battle is usually a good idea. As technology improves, combat width decreases, and the bonuses from defending become huge. These two factors mean you'll want to divide your army into smaller units and spread them across a front line. If you leave gaps, the enemy will pour through and occupy your territory. Since defense is so powerful, you're not likely to get it back. If you play Hearts of Iron, late-game wars will be familiar to you. Just knowing how to use your military isn't enough. Supplying it is just as important. Remember, in Victoria, everything's a commodity that exists in limited supply. Your army's gonna passively consume war materials, and you have to replace them. Luckily, at least in the early game, you won't have to worry about that. There will always be neutral countries willing to sell you war materials. All you need is money for them. This all changes by the endgame. By this point, several mechanics will have been introduced to ensure wars become larger, longer, and more consequential. This means there won't be many neutrals to buy from. The enemy definitely won't sell to you, and your allies are already at war, so they're using everything they're producing. This leaves you with whatever you produce locally. Once again, if you play Hearts of Iron, this will be familiar to you. Introducing Autarky. Autarky is where you secure your supply of war materials by making sure everything from the factories pumping out guns and tanks to the RGOs producing raw materials are under your control. War materials aren't all that matters. Domestic goods like coffee are important too. You gotta keep the home front happy. If you're fighting a total war, you don't want to waste your troops on rebellions. The last thing I want to talk about are the changes made in the HPM and HFM mods. Luckily, there are barely any. There's only one important difference. While in the base game, guards are an offense-oriented alternative to infantry, in HPM and HFM they're a straight upgrade, so replace all of your infantry with guards as soon as possible. So yeah, that was how to run your military in Victoria 2. Feel free to ask any questions you have in the comments, I'll get back to you pretty quick. Up next, we're going to talk about just what it is you're defending with that giant army. See you then.